So next I went on to looking at Elizabeth Murray's Do the Dance, as I had actually seen it in the MoMA when I went to New York on an art trip, and I was just so inspired of how she had used simplistic childlike shapes and also how some of the shapes that she incorporates within her pieces are ambiguous, but they also look like objects, and so they are perceived by different people as different things. And I just think it's really interesting how different people see different objects. And so I feel that the childlike shapes that Murray incorporates within her work was highly appropriate for me to research into, as obviously, like I've said with the Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared illustrations, that children's cartoons are often presented in a more simplistic way, as when children's minds are developing, they look at simplistic two-dimensional shapes and associate those with colours and letters, and that's how they learn to read and write and develop as children. So I just felt that it was integral to my artistic process that I would look into this specific piece of Elizabeth Murray's, as I was just so inspired by how the massive scale of her work, combined with the childlike forms as well as the bright vivid colour palette that she had used, I just felt that it was so appropriate for my work and that I had to analyse it. I feel that Murray's work is somewhat similar to Becky Sloan's and Joseph Pelling's Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, because the simplistic shapes are somewhat similar. However, I feel that Murray's are much more fluid due to the curves that she uses, as well as the fact that her shapes are far more abstract, whereas the ones that Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling use are definitely more simplistic, and they use two-dimensional shapes which are layered on top of one another in order to create a form that is recognisable. I also feel that both artists are similar in the sense that they both use vibrant colour palettes. However, I would say that Murray's is much more solid in colour, as this entire shape here was yellow with the green border, whereas the puppets within Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, because of the fact that they are textured, for example, this one is made of fur, there are different tones of green as the studio lights have hit it. So this one definitely appears more three-dimensional, whereas this one is definitely more two-dimensional. So next I decided to research into the textures as well as the colour palettes that Elizabeth Murray incorporates within her work, as I felt that I really loved the process of sketching the Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared characters, but it also became quite monotonous, and I just felt that I needed to experiment with texture in a different medium, because otherwise I would have just completely felt unmotivated and I wouldn't have wanted to do any work. So I felt that I needed to experiment with the colour palette that Murray uses, because I needed to get into the mindset behind her work, and I needed to experiment with a vibrant colour palette in order to understand that children's shows incorporate vibrant colour palettes, because they are ultimately providing entertainment but also education for children as their minds are developing, and having a very dark tonal palette would not necessarily be appropriate for a children's show, as it would just create an unsettling, horrible atmosphere and children would be too scared to watch it. So that's why a lot of corporations, when they make children's shows, they purposefully incorporate vibrant colour palettes. So with this piece, I initially started painting it onto a separate piece of paper, as I had photocopied my original sketches, and then I painted onto them, as I felt that in order to get the best of my studio time, that I would do drawings whilst this was drying. So that's why I did that onto a separate piece of paper, so that I could obviously continue to work in my sketchbook. So with this, as you can see, I've experimented with Elizabeth Murray's texture, as the paint appears very textured and rigid and bumpy, as when I was actually looking at Murray's Do the Dance in person, initially the colours were very flat, but then as you later on approached the piece closer, you could see that there had been thick layers of paint that had just been layered and layered and layered on top of one another, which I feel definitely added a more three-dimensional element to the piece. So I'm definitely glad that I was actually able to see the piece in person, as with photographs I wouldn't have known how impactful the sheer scale of it was, and I definitely wouldn't have seen the way that the light reflected upon certain parts of the piece and how it casts shadows to emphasise the texture of the paint. So I'm really glad that I got to see it in person. Then once these had dried, I decided to cut around the shapes, as I am quite a messy person, so I do find it really difficult to stay in the lines, and so a lot of this was overlapping and the colours did start to blend together, because I'm just naturally a messy person and I do find it quite difficult to be neat, but I use that to my advantage, and I feel that by cutting out the shapes and then arranging them, I felt that it just looks a lot more visually pleasing, because you have this very clean white border around everything and it makes it look regimented, which then in turn emphasises the childlike shapes that have been incorporated in Murray's work. I would say though that, however, there are some parts within the piece that I'm not particularly happy with. So, for instance, these yellow parts here, where some of the paint has mixed in together and created quite a muted dark yellow, which I feel isn't necessarily appropriate for Elizabeth Murray's colour palette, or the fact that I was initially going to make a children's show and that would have required studying bright colours. However, I am overall happy with the piece, as I love how fluid this large blue form is in the centre of the piece, as well as these overlapping diagonal lines, because you can see the way that when the light hits it, you can see the different tones that the shadows create as the paint is not completely level, which in turn I think adds a three-dimensional effect to this particular section, but I also feel that it adds a childlike quality to the piece overall, as a lot of children, when they are painting, they just tend to just completely go for it and they don't worry about having to make the surface completely flat. And so by me having more of a carefree process, I was able to mimic a childlike appearance, which I am very happy with, and it does definitely relate to my whole process of initially researching in order to make a children's show. This particular piece, which is also from Murray's Do the Dance, I just found it very effective in the sense that the uneven paint creates a three-dimensional effect, which was the same with the green section here on my previous piece. And I also feel that these marks here that mimic the curves that they are adjacent to, they add a cartoon-like quality to the whole piece, as in a lot of cartoons, movement is represented by lines being placed around the character. So in order to further understand the way in which Elizabeth Murray creates her work, I decided to take another step backwards and experiment with her abstract way of making objects look a lot more ambiguous and a lot more fluid. So I decided to look at objects in my room and then draw them in the form of continuous line and make sure that they were made abstract. I did this by pressing quite hard on the paper, as I feel that this sort of restricts the movements that I have when holding the pencil and therefore makes my marks a lot more abstract. And then I also tried to avoid drawing completely straight lines, and I purposefully made most of the lines very curved so that they would mimic the fluid motions that are within Murray's work. So obviously, as you can see, most of the objects you are able to tell what they are, but this is because I was still in the mindset that the objects still had to look like the objects that I was drawing. However, I do still quite like this piece because it later led me to the second piece, which is much more abstract, as I was able to reflect on the previous piece and see that I didn't need the fine details. So, for example, with the first piece, there is a can, and you can see that I've drawn the fine details which weren't needed, because with Murray's work, she just uses solid forms that aren't exactly detailed. They are just very fluid and very curvaceous. So from looking at that, I was able to then, when doing my second piece, I was able to think, right, I don't need these smaller details, and that I just needed one solid form. So I basically focused on the outlines rather than the details within them. Also, when drawing my second piece, I was still looking at objects around my room, but I was thinking, how can I make them more abstract? So, as I've said, I focused on drawing the outlines and making the lines a lot more curvaceous so that they were definitely more abstract in appearance. I also thought, perhaps, what marks could I make to represent the feelings that I have towards the objects? So, for example, towards the centre, I decided to draw a pair of hair straighteners, but obviously I made it look a lot more abstract because I just drew two very chunky lines to represent the top and the bottom half of the straighteners. And then, as I associate straighteners with heat, I then decided to draw a cluster of triangles to represent the heat coming off of the straighteners, which then abstracts the object even more so, because the triangles are definitely more abstract, as they are to represent a feeling and an association rather than an object itself. So with the process of both of these drawings, I did find it very, very challenging, because ever since I first started drawing, I was sort of programmed to draw in a way to represent the object that was in front of me, so I had to make it as lifelike as possible. So with this process, I did find it quite challenging, but then as I eased into it with the second piece, I definitely felt that it was a lot more fluid and a lot more natural to draw the way that things make me feel and the basic outlines, because it relates to my concept in the sense that I was originally doing a children's show, and I associate children's shows with simplistic mark making, because children, as they learn to draw and as they learn to read and write, they begin by doing very simplistic marks. So it made sense for me to draw in the way that a child would perhaps draw, and rather than the current mindset that I have as a teenager. But I do definitely love the way that these turned out, because they were so fluid and it was so refreshing to be able to just draw the basic shapes of what I saw and to represent what I associate with those objects, rather than feeling pressured to get the marks exactly right and the tone exactly right. It was just really interesting to be able to create marks that just represent the very basic structure of an object. So I would say that both of these pieces relate to Becky Sloan and Joseph Pelling's work, because their puppets that they have created are quite basic in shape. So for example, Yellow Guy is essentially an oval with two eyes and a circular nose with a tuft for hair, and so I definitely feel that they relate in that sense. I also feel that the ambiguity of the objects that I've created within my Murray experiments relate to the ambiguous atmosphere that Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared has, because you have these very vivid characters which are contrasted with the disturbing events that later on occur. Overall, I definitely do feel that practicing Murray's style of drawing, I was able to get myself into the mindset of the way that a children's illustrator would think, and it did definitely help put me into the mindset of being able to make a children's show. However, as I didn't make a children's show in the end, I would say that it definitely helped me in terms of my creation of my serial killer drawings, because from doing the Murray experiments, I was able to just look at the very basic shapes of the objects, and so when looking at photographs of the serial killers, I was able to just see the very basic shapes rather than this mass amount of detail from a three-dimensional form. And so I was able to take a step backwards and just look at the very basic features of the shape in order to create a character that had a cartoon style.